Elena Vasquez had never seen a building so beautiful in all her 63 years of life. She stood on the sidewalk outside the Grand City Concert Hall, her neck craned back, her eyes traveling up the tall marble columns that seemed to touch the evening sky. Golden light poured from the windows, and she could hear the faint sound of violins warming up somewhere inside. It sounded like something from another world. A world she had never belonged to. She looked down at the ticket in her hand. Row 3, seat 7. Her granddaughter Sophia had given it to her just last week, pressing it into her rough, calloused palm with so much excitement that Elena didn't have the heart to say no. Sophia's school choir had been invited to sing as the opening act for the city's famous orchestra. It was a big honor, and Sophia wanted her grandmother there more than anything. "Promise me you'll come, abuela," Sophia had said, her dark eyes wide and hopeful. "Promise me." And so Elena had promised. Even though the thought of sitting in a fancy concert hall made her stomach twist with nervousness. Even though she had nothing proper to wear. Even though she knew, deep in her bones, that places like this were not meant for women like her. Elena worked as a cleaning lady at St. Michael's Hospital. She had held that job for 22 years, ever since she and her husband had crossed the border from Mexico with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a dream of giving their children a better life. She cleaned floors, scrubbed toilets, emptied trash cans, and wiped down endless hallways that smelled of disinfectant and sickness. Her hands were rough and cracked from years of chemicals and hard work. Her back ached constantly, but she never complained. This was the life God had given her, and she was grateful for it. Tonight, she wore her best dress. It was navy blue with small white buttons down the front, simple but clean. She had bought it 8 years ago at a second-hand shop for her husband Roberto's funeral. It was the nicest thing she owned, and she had taken extra care to iron out every wrinkle before putting it on. She had even borrowed a small gold brooch from her neighbor, a little flower with a fake pearl in the center. It wasn't much, but it made her feel just a tiny bit special. She took a deep breath and walked toward the entrance. The lobby was even more overwhelming than the outside. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting rainbows of light across the polished marble floor. Men in expensive suits stood in small groups, laughing and holding glasses of champagne. Women glided past in elegant gowns, their jewelry catching the light, their perfume leaving trails of sweetness in the air. Everyone seemed to know each other. Everyone seemed to belong. Elena clutched her ticket tighter and kept her eyes on the floor as she walked. She felt like an intruder, like she had accidentally wandered into someone else's dream. She half expected a security guard to tap her on the shoulder and politely ask her to leave, but no one stopped her. No one even looked at her. To them, she was invisible. Just another face in the crowd. Easily overlooked. Easily forgotten. She found her way to the main auditorium and stopped in the doorway, her breath catching in her throat. The room was enormous, with rows and rows of red velvet seats rising up toward a ceiling painted with angels and clouds. A massive stage dominated the front, and on it sat the empty chairs and music stands of the orchestra, waiting like soldiers before battle. It was the most magnificent thing Elena had ever seen. She checked her ticket again. Row 3. That seemed very close to the front. Surely there had been some mistake. She walked down the center aisle, counting rows, her worn shoes silent on the thick carpet. Row 1, row 2, row 3. She found seat 7 and hesitated. The seats around her were already filling up with the kind of people she usually only saw in magazines. A woman in a cream-colored gown dripping with diamonds sat 2 seats away, fanning herself with her program. A man with silver hair and a perfectly tailored suit was helping his wife remove her fur coat. They all looked so polished, so perfect, so completely at ease in this world of beauty and culture. Elena sat down carefully, trying to make herself as small as possible. She placed her hands in her lap and stared straight ahead, afraid to make eye contact with anyone. She didn't know it then, but there had been a mix-up at the ticket office. These seats in the first few rows were normally reserved for the biggest donors and most important guests of the orchestra. People who gave thousands of dollars each year to support the arts. People who had their names engraved on brass plaques in the lobby. People who most certainly did not work as cleaning ladies at hospitals. But here she was, a simple woman from a small village in Mexico, sitting among the city's elite. The whispers started almost immediately. "Who is that?" The woman in diamonds murmured to her husband, not even bothering to lower her voice. Did she wander in from the street? Her husband shrugged. Perhaps she's someone's housekeeper. Got confused about where to sit. They both laughed softly, a polite, cruel kind of laugh that cut deeper than any shout ever could. Elena heard every word. Her face grew warm, and she felt a familiar shame rising in her chest. It was the same shame she had felt her whole life. The shame of being poor. The shame of being different. The shame of being seen as less than. She thought about getting up and finding a seat in the back, somewhere she wouldn't be noticed, somewhere she wouldn't cause trouble. But then, she thought of Sophia, her beautiful granddaughter, who believed in her, who was so proud to have her there, who had made her promise to come, so Elena stayed. She kept her eyes forward, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She would not let these people see her cry. She would not give them that satisfaction. The auditorium continued to fill. More wealthy patrons took their seats. More curious glances were thrown her way. More whispered comments floated through the air. But Elena had learned long ago how to become invisible, how to shrink into herself until she barely existed. It was a survival skill she had developed over decades of being overlooked and underestimated. What none of these people knew, what they never would have guessed just by looking at her, was that Elena Vasquez carried something precious inside her, something that couldn't be bought with money or displayed with diamonds. Back in her village in Mexico, before life had gotten so hard, before she had to leave everything behind, Elena had been known by a special name. They called her La Voz de los Angeles, the voice of angels. She had sung at every wedding, every funeral, every church service for 30 years. When she opened her mouth, people said it was like heaven itself was speaking. Old men would weep, children would fall silent, even the birds seemed to stop their singing just to listen. But that was a long time ago. Another life, another Elena. She hadn't sung in public for many years now. Life had gotten in the way. Work, bills, responsibilities. After Roberto died, the music inside her had gone quiet. It felt wrong to sing when her heart was so heavy with grief, so she stopped. She packed away that part of herself like an old photograph, something beautiful but belonging to the past. Now she was just Elena the cleaning lady, Elena who mopped floors and took out trash, Elena who was invisible. The lights in the auditorium began to dim, and a hush fell over the crowd. Elena felt her heart quicken with anticipation. Somewhere backstage, her granddaughter was preparing to perform. That was all that mattered. Not the whispers, not the looks, not the feeling of being an outsider in a world that didn't want her. She was here for Sophia. And nothing else mattered. But as the first notes of music began to fill the hall, Elena had no idea that this night would change everything. That before the evening was over, every single person in this grand auditorium would know her name, and that the people who had laughed at her would be the very same ones standing on their feet, tears streaming down their faces, wondering how they had ever been so blind. The story was just beginning. Maestro Friedrich Holzmann was not a man who tolerated imperfection. In his 40 years of conducting orchestras around the world, he had built a reputation that was equal parts brilliant and terrifying. Critics called him a genius. Musicians called him a tyrant. Both were right. He stood backstage in his private dressing room, adjusting his bow tie in the mirror for the third time. Everything had to be perfect. The angle of the tie, the shine of his shoes, the way his silver hair swept back from his forehead in a distinguished wave. Image mattered in this world. Image was everything. At 68 years old, Friedrich had conducted in the greatest concert halls on every continent. He had led performances for presidents and kings. His recordings had sold millions of copies. Awards and honors lined the walls of his study back home, so many that he had stopped counting years ago. He was, by any measure, one of the most successful conductors of his generation. But success had come with a price. Somewhere along the way, Friedrich had forgotten what it felt like to be ordinary. He had forgotten what it felt like to struggle, to doubt, to feel small. He had surrounded himself with people who agreed with everything he said, who laughed at all his jokes, who treated him like royalty. And slowly, without even realizing it, he had begun to believe that he truly was better than everyone else. Tonight was a special occasion. The annual fundraising gala for the Philharmonic, where the city's wealthiest donors gathered to write large checks and be seen by other important people. Friedrich usually avoided mingling with the audience. He preferred to let his music speak for itself. But the board of directors had insisted that he make an appearance during intermission. The donors expected it. They wanted to shake his hand, take photographs with him, tell their friends that they had spoken with the great Maestro Holzmann. So Friedrich would play his part. He would smile and nod and accept their compliments with false humility. It was exhausting, but it was necessary. The orchestra needed money to survive, and these rich fools were the ones who provided it. The first half of the concert went smoothly. The children's choir from the local school sang their opening numbers with the kind of earnest enthusiasm that made the audience smile and clap politely. They were not exceptional, but they were young and cute, and that was enough to warm the hearts of even the most jaded patrons. Friedrich watched from the wings, his arms crossed, his expression bored. Children's choirs were not his concern. He was here for the real music, the Beethoven and Brahms that would come in the second half. That was where his genius would shine. That was what these people had really come to see. When intermission arrived, Friedrich made his way to the grand lobby, where champagne was being served, and important people were gathering in small clusters. He put on his most charming smile and began to work the room. Maestro, what an honor. Maestro, you are truly a gift to this city. Maestro, my wife and I are such admirers of your work. Friedrich nodded graciously at each compliment, shaking hands, posing for photographs, pretending to remember names he had forgotten the moment he heard them. It was all so predictable, so tedious. These people knew nothing about music. They came to these concerts because it made them feel cultured and sophisticated, not because they truly understood or appreciated the art form. They were sheep dressed in expensive wool. He was making his way toward the bar when something caught his eye. A woman sitting alone on one of the velvet benches near the window. She looked completely out of place. Her dress was simple and clearly old, the kind of thing you might find at a church rummage sale. Her shoes were worn and practical. She wore no jewelry except for a small, fake-looking brooch pinned to her collar. And she was holding the concert program upside down. Squinting at it with obvious confusion, Friedrich stopped and stared. Who was this woman? How had she ended up here, among the diamond necklaces and designer gowns? She looked like someone's grandmother, the kind of woman who might sell tamales from a cart on the street corner, not the kind of woman who belonged in the third row of his concert hall. He turned to the small group of donors who had been following him around like puppies. A woman named Catherine, wife of some banking executive, was chattering about a vacation home in Switzerland. A man named Theodore, who owned half the commercial real estate downtown, was nursing his third glass of champagne. They were exactly the kind of people Friedrich had learned to tolerate. Look at this, Friedrich said, gesturing toward Elena with his champagne glass. His voice was casual but loud enough for those nearby to hear. It seems we have a lost tourist in our midst. Catherine followed his gaze and let out a small laugh. Oh my, did she wander in from the bus station? Perhaps she's looking for the bingo hall, Theodore added with a smirk. Someone should tell her that's 2 blocks east. The group laughed. It was a cruel, comfortable kind of laughter. The kind that comes easily when you are rich and powerful and have never known what it feels like to be the outsider. Friedrich smiled and shook his head in mock pity. They'll let anyone in these days, it seems. I suppose diversity has its limits. More laughter. A woman in pearls nearly choked on her champagne. Elena sat perfectly still on her bench. She did not look up. She did not react. But she heard every word. Every single word. Her face burned with shame and anger. But she had learned long ago how to keep those feelings locked inside. She had spent her whole life being looked down upon by people who thought their money made them better. Doctors at the hospital, who never bothered to learn her name. Wealthy homeowners who left their dirty dishes in the sink without a word of thanks. Store clerks who followed her around like she was going to steal something. She was used to it. That didn't mean it didn't hurt. What Friedrich Holtzmann did not know, what he never could have guessed by looking at this simple woman in her second-hand dress, was that Elena Vasquez understood music in a way he never would. She had not learned it from books or conservatories or expensive teachers. She had learned it from life itself. Her mother had taught her to sing before she could read. They would stand together by the river in their small village, washing clothes on the rocks while the sun beat down on their backs, and her mother would sing the old songs. Songs about love and loss, about hope and heartbreak, about the beautiful sadness of being alive. And Elena would sing along, her small voice mixing with her mother's, carried away on the wind to places she could only dream of. By the time she was 15, everyone in the village knew about Elena's gift. When she sang at the little stone church on Sundays, people would come from miles around just to listen. They said her voice could heal the sick and comfort the dying. They said it was a miracle, a blessing from God himself. But miracles don't pay the bills. And when Elena grew up and married Roberto, when they had children and struggled to survive, when they finally made the heartbreaking decision to leave everything behind and cross the border into a new country, the singing had to stop. There was no time for music when you were working 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. There was no room for dreams when reality demanded every ounce of your strength. So Elena had packed away her gift like a precious thing too fragile for this harsh world. She had become invisible. Just another tired woman scrubbing floors and raising children. Her voice silent except for the lullabies she whispered to her babies at night. But the music had never really left her. It was still there, sleeping inside her chest, waiting for the moment when it would be called forth again. Friedrich Holtzmann finished his champagne and checked his watch. Intermission was nearly over. Time to return to the stage and remind these people why they paid so much money to hear him conduct. He glanced one more time at the strange woman on the bench. She was still sitting there, still staring at her program, still looking like she had no idea where she was or what she was doing. Poor thing, he thought with a mixture of pity and contempt. She probably thinks a symphony is something you take for a cold. He laughed quietly to himself and walked away, never imagining that within the hour, this woman he had mocked would bring him to his knees. The lights in the lobby flickered, signaling the end of intermission. Elena rose slowly from her bench and made her way back to her seat in the 3rd row. The shame still burned in her chest, but beneath it, something else was stirring, something that had been asleep for a very long time. She didn't know it yet, but her moment was coming. And when it arrived, it would change everything. The second half of the concert was about to begin, and Elena settled back into her seat in the 3rd row. The woman in diamonds was still sitting nearby, but Elena refused to look at her. She kept her eyes fixed on the stage, waiting for the one thing that had brought her here tonight. Sophia. Her granddaughter was only 11 years old, but she had already shown more courage than most adults Elena knew. When Sophia's father had left and her mother had to work double shifts at the factory, it was Elena who stepped in to raise her. She walked Sophia to school every morning, helped her with homework every night, and listened to her practice, her choir songs, until she knew every word by heart. Sophia was the light of Elena's life. The reason she got up every morning. The reason she kept going even when her body ached and her spirit felt heavy. Everything Elena did, she did for that little girl. The lights dimmed and a hush fell over the auditorium. But instead of the orchestra taking the stage, the children's choir filed back out from the wings. Elena sat up straighter, her heart beginning to beat faster. This must be the special performance Sophia had told her about, the one she had been practicing for weeks. The choir director, a young woman with kind eyes and a warm smile, stepped up to the microphone at the front of the stage. She waited for the children to arrange themselves in neat rows before speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and confident. "Before we continue with tonight's program, the children have prepared a very special piece. It is a traditional Mexican folk song called La Llorona, which tells the story of a weeping woman searching for her lost children. This song has been passed down through generations, and it holds deep meaning for many families in our community." Elena felt her breath catch in her throat. La Llorona. She knew that song. She knew it better than she knew her own heartbeat. Her mother had sung it to her when she was just a baby. She had sung it at her grandmother's funeral. She had sung it on her wedding day. And again on the night Roberto took his last breath. That song was woven into the fabric of her soul. The choir director continued. In the spirit of honoring the cultural roots of this beautiful piece, we would like to invite any family member in the audience to join the children on stage for the final verse. This is a song meant to be shared across generations, and we thought it would be a lovely way to connect our young singers with their heritage. Elena's stomach tightened. Surely no one would volunteer. Surely this was just a polite gesture that would pass without incident. But then she saw movement on the stage. A small hand shooting up into the air. A familiar voice ringing out clear and strong. My abuela knows this song. It was Sophia. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. Every head in the auditorium turned toward the stage, where Sophia stood with her arm raised high, pointing directly at her grandmother in the third row. She's right there, Sophia continued, her young voice filled with pride. She sings it better than anyone in the whole world. She used to sing it in our village in Mexico. Everyone called her the voice of angels. A murmur rippled through the crowd. People craned their necks to see who this mysterious woman might be. And then, one by one, they found her. The simple woman in the navy blue dress. The one who looked so out of place among the silk and diamonds. The one they had whispered about and laughed at. Elena wanted to disappear. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her, judging her, wondering what this cleaning lady could possibly have to offer. In the wings of the stage, Maestro Friedrich Holzmann watched with an amused smirk on his face. This was going to be entertaining. The poor woman would probably mumble through a few bars and then slink back to her seat in embarrassment. It would be a nice bit of comedy to break up the evening. The choir director smiled warmly and looked out at Elena. Ma'am, would you like to join us? The children would be so honored. Every instinct in Elena's body screamed at her to say no, to shake her head politely and stay in her seat where it was safe. She had not sung in public for years. Her voice was old now, tired from decades of silence. What if she opened her mouth and nothing came out? What if she made a fool of herself in front of all these important people? But then she looked at Sophia. Her granddaughter stood on that stage with her hands clasped in front of her chest, her dark eyes shining with hope and love and absolute faith. Sophia believed in her. Sophia was proud of her. Sophia had just announced to an entire auditorium full of strangers that her grandmother was special, that she had a gift, that she was worth listening to. How could Elena let her down? She thought about all the times in her life she had made herself small. All the times she had stepped aside, stayed quiet, let others take the space she deserved. She thought about the laughter during intermission, the cruel jokes at her expense, the way these wealthy people had looked right through her like she was nothing. Something shifted inside her chest, something old and powerful that had been sleeping for a very long time. Elena stood up. The auditorium fell completely silent. Every eye was fixed on her as she stepped into the aisle. Her legs trembled beneath her, but she forced them to move. One step, then another, then another. The walk to the stage felt like the longest journey of her life. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She could feel the weight of all those stairs pressing down on her shoulders. But she kept walking. When she reached the steps at the side of the stage, a young stagehand offered her his hand to help her up. She took it gratefully, her fingers shaking against his steady grip, and then she was on the stage, standing in front of hundreds of people, the bright lights warm on her face. Sophia rushed over and grabbed her hand. I knew you would come, abuela, she whispered. I knew you would be brave. Elena squeezed her granddaughter's hand and felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. Brave. Is that what this was? It didn't feel like bravery. It felt like terror. The choir director handed her a small piece of paper with the lyrics to the final verse. But Elena didn't need it. She knew every word. She had known them since before she could read. The children arranged themselves around her. their young faces turned up toward her with curiosity and expectation. The orchestra sat silent in the pit below. The audience waited, some with skepticism, some with pity, a few with genuine interest. And in the wings, Maestro Friedrich Holzmann leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, ready to watch this poor woman embarrass herself. The choir director raised her hand to begin. Elena closed her eyes. For a moment, she was not standing on a stage in a grand concert hall. She was back in her village, standing by the river with her mother. She was in the little stone church, singing for her neighbors and friends. She was holding Roberto's hand on their wedding day, her voice rising toward the heavens as tears of joy streamed down her face. The music had never left her. It had been waiting, patient and faithful, for this exact moment. The choir director's hand came down, and the children began to sing. Their voices were sweet and pure, filling the auditorium with the haunting melody of La Llorona. They sang the first verse, then the second, their harmonies blending together like colors in a sunset, and then came the final verse. The children's voices faded to a soft hum. The spotlight shifted, and every person in that auditorium held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Elena opened her mouth, and everything changed. The first note that came out of Elena's mouth was unlike anything that auditorium had ever heard. It started low and soft, rising up from somewhere deep inside her chest. A sound so pure and so full of aching beauty that it seemed to stop time itself. The note hung in the air like morning mist over a quiet river, delicate and haunting, and impossibly real. There was no microphone, no amplification, just Elena's voice, raw and unadorned, filling every corner of that massive concert hall as if the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. The children stopped humming. Their mouths fell open. They had practiced this song for weeks, but nothing had prepared them for this. Their choir director stood frozen, her hand still raised, tears already forming in her eyes. Elena did not notice any of this. She had gone somewhere else, somewhere deep inside herself, where the music lived. Her eyes were closed, her weathered face tilted slightly upward, and the words of La Llorona poured out of her like water from a spring that had been blocked for too many years. She sang of a woman searching for her lost children. She sang of grief so heavy it could drown the soul. She sang of love that refuses to die, even when everything else is gone. But more than that, she sang her own story. Every note carried the weight of her life. Every phrase held a piece of her heart. She sang for her mother, who had taught her this very song while they washed clothes in the river so many years ago. She sang for her father, who had worked himself to death in the fields just to keep his family fed. She sang for the village she had left behind, the dusty streets and simple houses and the people who had loved her voice and called her special. She sang for Roberto, her husband, her best friend, the man who had held her hand through every struggle and every joy for 35 years. The man who used to sit in the kitchen and listen to her sing while she cooked dinner, who would close his eyes and smile and say that her voice was the most beautiful thing God had ever created. The man whose absence still felt like a hole in her chest that would never heal. She sang for all the years of silence, all the times she had swallowed her voice and made herself small, all the mornings she had woken up before dawn to scrub hospital floors while her bones ached and her spirit felt heavy, all the moments she had been invisible, overlooked, dismissed as nothing more than a cleaning lady with rough hands and a tired face. And she sang for Sophia, her beautiful granddaughter who had believed in her when no one else did, who had stood up in front of all these strangers and declared that her abuela was worth listening to, who had given her the courage to stand on this stage and remember who she really was. The Spanish words needed no translation. Everyone in that auditorium understood exactly what Elena was singing, because she was singing in the universal language of human emotion. Pain and love and loss and hope, all woven together in a melody that seemed to reach directly into the chest and squeeze the heart. In the third row, the woman in diamonds had stopped whispering. Her hand was pressed against her mouth, and tears were streaming down her carefully made-up face. She had lost her own mother just 6 months ago, and something in Elena's voice had cracked open the grief she had been trying so hard to hide. Beside her, her husband sat perfectly still, his champagne forgotten, his eyes fixed on the stage. He was thinking about his father, a man he had never been close to, a man who had died before they could ever say the things that needed to be said. He didn't understand why this simple song was making him feel so much. But he couldn't look away. In the orchestra pit, the musicians sat motionless at their instruments. A violinist in the front row had tears running down her cheeks. She had spent 20 years perfecting her technique, studying at the finest conservatories, performing with the most prestigious orchestras in the world. But in this moment, she understood that all her training meant nothing compared to what this woman possessed. This was not skill. This was not technique. This was something that could not be taught, or learned, or bought. This was the raw, unfiltered sound of a human soul. The cellist next to her quietly wiped his eyes with his sleeve. The flutist had given up trying to hold back her emotions, and was openly weeping. Even the percussionist, a gruff man who rarely showed any feeling at all, had to look down at his hands to hide the moisture in his eyes. And in the wings of the stage, Maestro Friedrich Holzmann stood absolutely frozen. His arms had fallen to his sides. His smirk had disappeared. His face had gone pale, and his eyes were wide with something he had not felt in a very long time. Shock, disbelief, and somewhere beneath all of that, shame. In 40 years of conducting, he had worked with the greatest singers in the world, sopranos who had trained for decades, tenors who could shatter glass with their high notes, voices that had been polished and perfected until they gleamed like diamonds. But he had never heard anything like this. This woman, this cleaning lady he had mocked and laughed at, was producing a sound that made everything he had ever accomplished feel small. Her voice was not perfect in the technical sense. It did not have the trained precision of an opera singer or the controlled vibrato of a professional performer. But it had something far more valuable. It had truth. It had soul. It had the kind of raw, devastating honesty that cannot be faked or manufactured. Friedrich felt something crack inside his chest. A wall he had built over decades of success and arrogance and carefully maintained superiority. He thought of all the times he had dismissed people who did not meet his standards, all the musicians he had belittled and berated, all the moments he had looked down on others simply because they were not as accomplished or educated or refined as he believed himself to be. And now here was this woman, this simple woman in her second-hand dress, teaching him what music was really about. It was not about awards or prestige or standing ovations from wealthy donors. It was not about perfect technique or impressive credentials. It was about connection. It was about reaching into the deepest parts of the human experience and pulling out something true. It was about making people feel less alone in their pain and their joy and their struggle to make sense of this beautiful, difficult life. Elena's voice soared higher, reaching the climax of the song. The notes seemed to fill not just the auditorium but the entire world. People who had been holding back their tears finally let them fall. Strangers reached for each other's hands without thinking. Something sacred was happening. Something that transcended language and culture and social status. And then, slowly, Elena brought the song home. Her voice grew softer, more tender, like a mother singing a lullaby to a child. The final notes floated through the air and then faded into silence. For 3 full seconds, no one moved, no one breathed. The silence was so complete that you could hear the soft hum of the lights above the stage. Elena opened her eyes. She looked out at the audience, at all those faces staring back at her. And for a moment she felt afraid. Had she made a mistake? Had she embarrassed herself and Sophia in front of all these important people? And then she saw the tears. They were everywhere, streaming down the faces of men in expensive suits and women in designer gowns, glistening on the cheeks of the children standing beside her, falling from the eyes of musicians who had heard thousands of performances but never anything like this. The woman in diamonds was sobbing into her hands. The silver-haired man beside her had tears running down his face without shame. Even the ushers standing at the back of the auditorium were wiping their eyes, and still, no one made a sound. Elena stood there in the spotlight, this simple woman from a small village in Mexico, and waited for what would come next. She did not have to wait long. It started with one person. A man in the back row who rose to his feet, his hands coming together in a single, thunderous clap. Then the woman beside him stood. Then the couple in front of them. Then an entire row. Then another. Within seconds, the entire auditorium was on its feet. The applause was deafening. It crashed through the concert hall like a wave, bouncing off the painted ceiling and the marble walls, filling every inch of space with sound. But it was not the polite, measured applause that these wealthy patrons usually offered. This was something raw and real and desperate, the kind of applause that comes from people who have just experienced something that touched their souls. Elena stood on the stage, blinking in the bright lights, unable to process what was happening. All around her, the children of the choir were clapping and jumping with excitement. Sophia had thrown her arms around her grandmother's waist and was holding on tight, her small body shaking with happy tears. "You did it, abuela," Sophia whispered into her grandmother's dress. "I knew you could do it." Elena placed her hand on her granddaughter's head and stroked her soft hair. She still could not quite believe what was happening. These people, these wealthy, important people who had looked right through her just an hour ago, were now standing and cheering as if she were the most famous singer in the world. The woman in diamonds was on her feet, clapping so hard her bracelets rattled on her wrists. Tears had ruined her mascara, leaving dark streaks down her cheeks. But she did not seem to care. The silver-haired man beside her had his hand over his heart, his eyes red and wet, nodding his head slowly as if he had just witnessed something sacred. In the orchestra pit, the musicians had risen from their seats. The violinist, who had wept during Elena's performance, was now applauding with her bow still in her hand. The cellist was wiping his eyes with one hand and clapping with the other. Even the gruff percussionist was on his feet, his usual stern expression replaced with something that looked almost like wonder. The applause went on and on. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3. People were not just clapping anymore. They were shouting, cheering. Some were still crying. A few had their hands raised in the air, as if trying to capture the moment and hold on to it forever. And then, from the wings of the stage, a figure emerged. Maestro Friedrich Holzmann walked slowly into the spotlight. The audience's applause faltered slightly as people noticed him. Everyone knew who he was. Everyone expected him to take his place at the podium and continue with the evening's program. But Friedrich did not walk toward the podium. He walked toward Elena. The auditorium grew quiet. People lowered themselves back into their seats, confused and curious about what was happening. The children of the choir parted to make way as the famous conductor approached the simple woman in the navy blue dress. Elena watched him come closer, her heart pounding in her chest. She remembered his cruel words during intermission, the jokes at her expense, the laughter that had cut deeper than any knife. Part of her wanted to turn away, to protect herself from whatever new humiliation he might have planned. But she did not turn away. She stood her ground and met his eyes. Friedrich stopped directly in front of her. For a long moment, he simply looked at her. This woman he had dismissed as nothing. This woman he had mocked in front of his wealthy friends. This woman who had just delivered the most powerful musical performance he had witnessed in 4 decades. His eyes were wet. His hands were trembling slightly at his sides. And when he spoke, his voice cracked with emotion. "I owe you an apology," he said. The auditorium was so silent, you could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning. "Earlier this evening, I said terrible things about you. I laughed at you. I made jokes at your expense." Friedrich's voice broke, and he had to pause to collect himself. "I looked at your dress and your shoes, and decided that you had nothing to offer. I thought I knew everything about music, about art, about what makes a performance great." He shook his head slowly, his silver hair catching the light. "I was a fool," he continued. "A blind, arrogant fool. What you just did on this stage. I have conducted the greatest orchestras in the world. I have worked with singers who trained for decades at the finest conservatories. But I have never, in all my years, I heard anything that moved me the way your voice just did." Elena said nothing. She simply watched him, her dark eyes calm and steady. Friedrich took a deep breath. And then, slowly, the great Maestro Holzmann did something he had not done in 40 years of conducting. He bowed. A gasp rippled through the audience. The most celebrated conductor in the city, a man known for his pride and his exacting standards, was bowing to a cleaning lady from a hospital. "Forgive me," Friedrich said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I am the fool who laughed at a nightingale because she was not wearing feathers." For a moment, Elena did not respond. She looked at this man who had hurt her, who had made her feel small and worthless in front of strangers. She thought about all the times in her life she had been treated this way, all the people who had dismissed her because of how she looked, or where she came from, or what kind of work she did. She could have been angry. She could have refused his apology and walked away. She had every right to. But Elena had never been the kind of person who held on to bitterness. Life was too short and too precious to waste on anger. And she could see in Friedrich's eyes that his remorse was real. His shame was genuine. This was not a performance for the audience. This was a man who had just learned something important about himself, and it had shaken him to his core. Elena reached out and took his hand. Her rough, calloused fingers wrapped around his smooth, manicured ones. "Music does not care what we wear," she said softly. "It only cares what we carry in our hearts." Friedrich's face crumpled. Tears spilled down his cheeks, and he made no effort to hide them. He squeezed her hand and nodded, unable to speak. The audience watched in stunned silence. And then, slowly, the applause began again. But this time, it was different. This time, it was not just for Elena's voice. It was for something bigger, for the power of humility, for the grace of forgiveness, for the reminder that every person, no matter how they look or where they come from, deserves to be seen and heard and treated with dignity. The following week, Friedrich called Elena with an invitation. He wanted her to perform with the orchestra during their next season. A solo performance, just her voice, and whatever accompaniment she desired. He would pay her whatever she asked. He would give her top billing. He would make sure the whole city knew her name. Elena thanked him kindly, and then she said no. She had floors to mop and a granddaughter to raise. She had a life that was simple but full, humble but meaningful. She did not need fame or money or recognition from important people. She had already received the only thing that mattered. She had reminded herself of who she really was, but Friedrich would not let the story end there. He established a new tradition for the Philharmonic. Every year, on the anniversary of that unforgettable night, the orchestra would perform La Llorona, and in the front row, in a seat that would be permanently reserved in her name, Elena Vasquez would sit with her granddaughter Sofia and listen. She never sang publicly again. She did not need to. That one performance had been enough. It had reminded an entire room full of important people of something they had forgotten. That greatness does not come from money or status or expensive clothes. That the most beautiful music often comes from the most unexpected places. That every human being, no matter how invisible they might seem, carries something precious inside them. And whenever Sophia told the story years later, she always ended it the same way. "My grandmother was a cleaning lady," she would say. "She mopped floors and scrubbed toilets and never complained. But on one night, in a room full of people who thought they were better than her, she opened her mouth and reminded everyone what it means to be truly great. Greatness does not announce itself," Sophia would finish, her voice soft with love and memory. "It simply is."